What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Like Stars podcast. I'm your host, Dr. P. Goodman, and taking a little bit of time off. Sorry about that. Been out for a few weeks, but I wanted to dive back in and do another episode this week with some other topics and ideas. Now, before I just jump in, there's a few things I want to share. First of all, if you are someone that's been, again, maybe listening kind of regularly, you know that I had just done kind of a two-part series on this concept of women in the church, women in ministry. And on my last episode, I mentioned that I was going to do an interview with someone who had experience in that area. Now, I just want to get some clarity. I still am hoping to do that. It's created some good conversations. The person I was going to do it with wasn't able to, but I still want to do that in the future. That's not the reason why I haven't posted, but just a lot going on. But that will be coming. But today I'm actually going to kind of just take a little bit of a break and go in a slightly different direction. But we will be coming back to that hopefully in the near future. So today on this episode of the podcast, I'm going to maybe do things similar but a little bit different. Over the past probably 5 or 6 episodes, I've really been leaning into some very specific big ideas. We've talked about the image of God, creationism, predestination, women in ministry, kind of like the whole podcast dedicated to these big ideas, tithing, the law, things like that. And today I'm just kind of over the past few weeks, I've had a lot of questions come in, so I thought I'm just going to run through some questions. This will be kind of a Q&A podcast. There's no one specific big topic. Questions about patriotism, different parts of Scripture, questions about parenting, even what I can offer, whatever. Just going to get through as many as I can, and kind of be quick hitters, hopefully. And so, yeah, we'll come back. We have some other big topics I'm planning on wanting to talk through in the near future. Not quite ready for any of them yet. So this is just a way to get something out this week and stay up on some of the questions that you guys have been sending my way. As always, thank you so much for those of you that have been sending in questions. Please keep it up, keep going. Podcasts like this will be probably more prevalent in the future as I have more chance to get to all of everything. So you can email me, pete@risecitychurch.com. You can find me on social media, Like Stars Facebook, Like Stars Podcast on Instagram, and at Like Stars Podcast on YouTube. Today's podcast, also our sponsor today, real quick. Our sponsor today is another real company, Hostess Cupcakes. Hostess Cupcakes are sponsoring this. Now, you might say to yourself, okay, every time Pete does this, it's always some bit that he's got some angry bone to pick with this person or that person. How could this guy possibly be angry at Hostess Cupcakes? Well, let me tell you something. I'm not. Oh no. I love Hostess Cupcakes. I think that they're pretty much one of the most perfect foods humans have ever created. But the reason why they are your host today is because as I've been recording this podcast over the past month or two, I have to look myself in this little camera and realize I need to go on a diet. So I did that. And can I just say this? No, if there's anything I'm being critical of, it's being on a diet. And I just love Hostess Cupcakes so much that I thought since I can't eat them right now, I would at least remind myself how wonderful they are. So Hostess Cupcakes, I miss you. But you know what? It's worth it to get in shape. Maybe I'm in my 40s. Who cares? Whatever. I'm doing it. I'm committed. Anybody else out there trying to lose some weight, doing the whole diet thing? It's the worst. Whatever. Okay. Let's see. Let's dive in. Let's jump in this week and talk about some of the things that you have been asking me. And I'll have these questions on my computer here. I'm just going to read them straight out. And whereas in some of the previous episodes, I've really done some research and study and prep time, not as much with these. So you're going to get a little bit more of my raw answers in this as much as possible. So here we go. Here's a question that came a while ago, but I haven't been able to get to it. And it's a doozy. Okay, somebody asked me this. As Christians, is it okay or should we be willing to die for our country? Should we be willing to die for our country? Is it okay? Now, I got that question a while ago, and I said, hey, I'll try to answer it in a future podcast. I kind of put it off, and I threw it on this morning and just thinking it through. So let me give you some thoughts about this as I kind of unpack it. I don't have a specific, here's a Bible verse that completely supports everything I want to say. A lot of this podcast, I like these topics that get into more the ideas of wisdom and as what do we know from the scriptures? What can we pull from it? What do we know from history of all this kind of stuff? And so this is one of those difficult questions. starting with someone named St. Augustine in the 4th century. He came up with an idea that he called the just war. And Augustine essentially, and I don't have it in front of me, but Augustine argued basically that it's okay to go to war because up to before that, most all Christians were pacifists. They wouldn't serve in the army and things. Augustine argued that it's okay to go and fight a war as long as it was just, as long as you were doing something that, it wasn't just like you wanting to steal somebody else's property or something, or two kings got mad at each other, so here's 1 million people going to kill each other. His argument was it had to be a just war. Now, he didn't necessarily base that on a particular scripture. It wasn't like, well, here in this verse, it says if you want, he was sort of doing what I'm doing right now, trying to come up with what makes sense to us. There's a few places you could look at. So even if you'd say, well, Augustine, is that biblical? He might say, well, it's probably more to my opinion, but he probably thought it was biblical. I don't know. It was 1,600 years ago. But the bigger question that really came out of Augustine's just war theory is, well, who decides what is just? What does it mean to even be just in the first place? And so there's really no specific answer for it. I want to give you one thing we can say. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, as he moves past all of his arguments and gets to chapter 12, he starts breaking down specific aspects of the Christian life. What does this new life look like? And he goes into a whole section about not seeking revenge. He says, don't go after it yourself. Don't seek revenge. It's not your place. Instead, he then goes into chapter 13, and he builds a case in chapter 13 for the role of what we would say the government, authority. And he talks about submitting to authority. But when he's talking about submitting to authority in chapter 13 of Romans, he's doing it in the context of right off the heels of vengeance. Because in the ancient world, if somebody wronged you, the expectation was you would then go and wrong them back. That's the way the world worked. That was the only way justice ever happened. Justice could only happen is if you kill one of my cows, I'm going to go kill one of your cows, right? If you do something to one of my children, I'm going to do something to one of your children. Eye for an eye. And now in the New Testament, you have Paul developing a whole different approach to this, which is, no, leave vengeance to somebody else. Don't take it. Because all that happens is when you take it yourself, you're just going back and forth. You're creating a cycle. It's getting worse and worse. Instead, Paul's argument is essentially governments are in place to be sort of unbiased, neutral arbitrators of dealing justice. And so he says this, and I'm reading from Romans 13 in verse 4. He says, the one in authority, the government, is God's servant for good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Kind of heavy stuff there, but essentially Paul's argument is the purpose. One of the purposes of government is to handle justice, and so I've made this case before in other places. But I would kind of, again, I'm giving some opinion here, but I think based on this passage and others, I think I would defend it well. God does want justice. It is clear from Scripture that God wants justice. He wants justice to reign. He doesn't want injustice. He also doesn't want people constantly killing each other and fighting each other. He wants humanity to get along. And so he empowers governments who are neutral, unbiased, hopefully, they're supposed to be. And so if you and another human being get in an issue and get fighting, and you're both, passionate and riled up, the government can step in, the police, military, whatever, and hopefully adjudicate it in a fair way. That's his argument. Now, we all know that sometimes the governments don't do it in a fair way. We know governments can be corrupt and mistaken and whatever, but the principle is there. So I would argue from that principle that if you are a person who is serving this role, if you are a person who's been entrusted with the authority of the sword, quote unquote, gun today, I guess, and you represent the government and their role in adjudicating justice and also protecting those who need to be protected, I think that's where Augustine was coming up with this just war thing. I do believe that there are times in the world when wickedness has to be stopped, when evil has to be defeated, and sometimes really bad behavior needs to be punished. What the scriptures tell us is it's not your job as the average normal citizen. It's the job of the government. So, bring this all back around, I actually do think, yes, if you are part of the government, if you're part of the military, if you're part of the police force, then as a Christian, I think it's perfectly acceptable to bear arms and do those kind of things. If you're not, I would question to what extent you think you should be doing that. Wisdom tells us that sometimes in a broken world, we're going to need to defend those who can't be defended. And we're going to need to sometimes fight against evil. And that includes a standing police force and an army. We can be Christians and strive for a better world, especially in our own lives, the way that we live, while at the same time acknowledging that a lot of the world is a very dark and broken place. All of that being said, let me say one more thing. We have to be wary, though, of again, what does it mean for a just war? Because let's be honest, a lot of wars are not nearly as just as we want to make them out to be. A lot of wars in human history were just people making up excuses to get what they wanted or fight back. And that's a problem. To really know what is just is difficult. I think historically, a lot of us can look at World War II and be like, was that a just war? Yeah, Nazism needed to be stopped. Other wars, it's tough to say. I don't always know where the line is there. I think you got to trust the Lord and you got to seek wisdom. I think that if you have made a pledge to join a military and your government sends you and it seems reasonable, then yeah, if it violates your conscience, what you think your government's doing, then I think your conscience would dictate that you should step down from it. But again, I can't say this or that. It's all circumstantial. I will say this though, I'm very wary of nationalism. Dying for your country is probably the part of that sentence that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. I think as a Christian, we should be willing to die for the cause of freedom, battling oppression, and protecting the innocent. For your country, just because your country wants it. So if your country says, we want more oil, let's go fight that nation and take their oil, and you die, were you dying for your country? I mean, that's not a good thing to die for. I don't have any interest in dying for my country personally, because my country is just a nation. I mean, I'm loyal to America. I'm an American. I'm glad I live here, but I'm not going to die for America. I think the question, though, of Jesus saying, greater love is no one that he laid his life down for a friend, like there are things that I'm willing to put my life at risk for. And if America is stepping into a situation in order to protect the innocent, battle evil, things like that, then again, I'm putting my life on the line for that is a different issue. All right, that was a little bit of rambling. Hopefully I didn't say anything too heretical. But yeah, it's a good question. Great question. A lot more to talk about for sure. All right, let's do another one. Question number 2. I've heard it said that we are to be in the world, but not of the world. What does this mean, and is it actually true? Well, I love that question because it's 2 important questions. What does it mean, and is it true? They're 2 different things, and they're both important questions. I mean, I think we all know kind of what it means. Whether or not it's true might be a different question. So generally speaking, when people say you should be in the world but not of it, there are really 2 very distinct ways that phrase can be used. And the differences might seem small, but they kind of matter. I've heard that phrase used in the sense of, well, this world is not my home. I'm actually a spiritual being who belongs in heaven. I'm just kind of passing through. So yeah, I'm temporarily here, but eventually I'm going to leave and go somewhere else. If that's how you're using that phrase, I have serious problems with it. And anyone who's listened to any of my podcasts would probably know that. But there's another way to use that phrase that I think gets more to what, I'd say if there's truth to it, it'd be this. And I did a little bit on this just because I was reading the questions. It brought me back to John 17. In John 17, he's praying for his followers, and Jesus says, I have given them, your people, your word, verse 14, and the world has hated them. Now, when John uses the word world, I want you to be cautious, especially when you're reading a book like John and a lot of the New Testament. This word world, we can kind of mistake him saying anything that's like physical, like creation, the earth. And sometimes that's hard because like a word like a cosmos in Greek, it can mean like the world, cosmos. But when John uses it this way and Paul uses it this way, it's not so much like the physical reality, like physical bodies or the physical planet. It's more like the thought process, the system, like the way that human beings are currently doing things. He says the world, the humanity in general, it's like has hated them. And then he says this, for they, my followers, are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer, and then he goes on in verse 15, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from evil. Okay, so this is kind of probably where that idea in the world, not of the world comes from, probably John 17. And it's important to notice, and I don't want to get too detailed in the Greek here, but when John says they are not of, this, if you think of like a exo, like to excavate, or an exoskeleton, it's to pull out of, or it doesn't originate from. When he says you're not of the world, as I am not of the world, I think it's a mistake to read that passage and hear Jesus saying, my followers aren't really like physical human beings. They're just sort of temporarily inhabiting these things. But really, we're of heaven. We're not of earth. Just like I don't think that's what Jesus is saying, because it's actually counterproductive and counters all the story of creation in Genesis. Humans are physical. Humans are of nature, of the world. Part of who we are and what we are is natural, is of the world. When Jesus says of the world in this context, he's meaning the system of the world. He's meaning the way that people think, the way, what people value, what people deem as good, like the general zeitgeist, the worldview. Like, you're not part of that. You think differently. You're not connected to it. You're separate from it. You're weird from it. And I know this specifically because of the next verse. My prayer is not that you take them out of it. Like Jesus says right there in verse 15, it's not that I want all my disciples to be raptured up into the heavens and go live on a cloud for eternity. No, I've talked about this before. That's not the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible is God redeeming the earth. I'm not praying that you would leave the earth. Instead, I'm praying that you would not become like the way the world currently thinks. I'm praying that you'd not become like this system. And Paul picks this up in Romans when he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In order, he essentially says, do not, he starts off, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Like, don't be defined by the way the world does things, by the way the world thinks things are good. Like, the world decides is what's valuable and what's important and what to pursue and how to treat people. Don't be formed, because the modern thought process of most people, the Bible tells us, is wrong. Instead, be transformed and take on a different mindset, the mind of Christ, we're told. So Jesus is like saying, my mindset, the way that I look at life and reality is different than the world. And I don't want my followers to be defined by that. I want them to be defined by me. We're all here. We're all physical. We're all sharing this planet together. And according to Revelation, we will for eternity on some level, when Jesus returns and brings all those who have died in Christ with him. So to be of the world, to not be of the world can't be, you're not physical. In fact, the idea that being physical is somehow bad or wrong is not Christianity, it's Greek agnosticism. Plato, the Greek philosopher, is the one who first got this thought going that our current existence is more, we're looking at life as though it's a shadow on a cave wall and the real world is out there somewhere. And we have to escape these mortal prisons and go to some higher plane of existence. That's not what John is saying here. The world that God created good, he wants to remake and reform good. But in order for that to happen, human beings have to stop thinking like the brokenness, the broken way of seeing the world that's rooted in rebellion against God, and instead see that Christ alone is not, his mindset is not based on the brokenness of the world, because he is not part of it. He's free from sin, free from defect. So he's not praying that we would leave the world. It's not escapism. It's that we would be conformed to his wisdom. And that's what this whole podcast is about for me personally. I want to talk about the wisdom of God that transforms our thinking to look like Jesus and not like the rest of the world. When the rest of the world is saying, we think this is how you should handle the situation, I want to say, what does Jesus say? How does he say to handle the situation? Because I want to be conformed to him. I don't want to leave the world, but I want to be protected from that which is bad, evil, the ra we talked about in this podcast, and see the tov, the good that God has for me in Jesus, to be transformed into his image. So I do want to not be, I'm not of the world. I don't want to be of the world in the way that I think and process and live my life, but I am part of the world. Instead, I want to be a part of the world the way that God created and intended it. So, all right, well, that's question number 2. Let's keep going. I'm kind of, I know this is longer. This next one is fun. Number 3, here's the third question that came in. Homeschooling. All right. Not every Christian can do it, ... wouldn't it be better to send them, I'm assuming kids, into the schools to help with the spread of the word of God in their own kind of way? All right, so this person is asking essentially, if I could maybe just read into this, there's a tension with parents who have Christian homes and Christian children. And the tension is, I would say it's both homeschooling. You could also say maybe like a Christian schools, private schools, charter schools versus maybe like a general public school. Should we take our kids and put them in these separatist, whether it's a homeschool or a Christian school, private schools, in order to quote unquote kind of protect them and keep them safe from what the world might be teaching? Or wouldn't it be better to let our Christian kids be in the public schools so they can actually be a light and shine to other students who need to hear it? And this is a fantastic question. There's two really big tensions that exist behind it that come from different sides of it, and I'll try to address them both. Let me start by saying this. I started ministry as a youth pastor. So when I first started following Jesus, within the first year, the first year as a Christian, I was working with college students, then I graduated and I jumped right into youth ministry. And I was in youth ministry for about 10 years, working with middle school and high school students, college students. And when I was, say, 24, 25 years old, if you had asked me what I thought about Christian schools, you would not have gotten a very positive answer. I didn't like them. They always bothered me. I was always like, I don't like Christian schools. I don't like the fact that, number one, we're just putting them in a bubble. We're not teaching these kids how to really handle real life. A lot of times Christian schools can be even worse because the kids are just fake. And, maybe even worse, like we're taking all the kids that are supposed to be a light to the world and we're putting them somewhere else and we're leaving the schools to all sort of go to hell. So I had a real problem with it. And often if parents ask my opinion, I'm like, no, get them in public school, let them go be Jesus to the world. Excuse me. Then something happened. I had children, and I had children in Southern California. I have 4, and my wife and I are raising them in the San Diego area. And, let's just say maybe I've had to do a little bit of soul searching about previous beliefs I had. The truth is, there's a couple things that I guess at 44, which is how old I am now, having 4 kids, the oldest is almost 13, my youngest is 6. Let me say this. The idea that first off, let me talk about shouldn't we be putting our kids in the schools so they can be light to the world? The truth is there's a tension that we have to acknowledge. And the tension is, I want my kids to learn and understand what it means to show Jesus to other people. But I also understand that until they get to a certain age, the extent to which they are impressionable to whatever they're taught and surrounded is just so immense. And what I have to do as a father, and my wife has to do as a mother, and we as parents, is sort of analyze this and say, is the kind of environment that they're going to be put in at this school over here going to even allow them to thrive and be fully followers of Jesus in order to shine? Or is there a really high probability that environment could consume them because it's gotten so dark? And let's be honest, I know some of you teachers out there, please, I'm not trying to attack anybody, but I think I think a lot of people watching this podcast would nod their head and say the public school system, especially in Southern California, has gotten kind of dark in some serious areas. So now more than ever, I understand. There's a part of me that says I would rather focus on my kids being healthy until they're old enough to know how to handle some of this stuff. So to be honest, and this is an odd thing for me to say because it's very different than what I've answered 20 years ago. My wife and I have chosen to put our kids into a charter school that's much more controlled with good values and a lot of Christian teachers. And it's not necessarily a Christian school, but we like the environment and we're choosing it for the environment. My oldest daughter is being homeschooled. So I'm kind of there. And so when I see other parents choosing Christian schools or homeschool or these things, I get where you're coming from because it's just gotten really bad. And that even maybe in my defense 20 years ago, I don't think it was as bad as it is now 20 years ago. I mean, the things that some of these schools are teaching, where I live is actually not too bad. I in here out in East County, San Diego, but man, I just, there's a part of me now. The reality though is not everyone has a choice. So if you were asking me that question, or maybe you're listening and you've thought about that, and you're hearing me say that and say, well, I agree with that, Pete. The problem is I don't have a choice. I work all day. I can't homeschool. And have you seen the price tag on some of these private Christian schools? Yes, I have. So look, I think the reality is so I'll give you my answer. In a perfect world, if I have the money or whatever, I probably, today living in where I live, I would try to get them out of my public schools. But I don't say that to put guilt on you. If you're someone like, we just can't afford it. Look, I get it. Most people where I live here in Southern California, they're both, dual income, both working, just trying to pay the rent or keep food on the table. The idea of staying home to homeschool or paying for private schools is just not realistic. So I would say this, if that's where you're at, which I know many of you are, no guilt. I mean, no guilt. Goodness, no guilt. I know it's tough. Look, it was tough in the first century as well when their kids were surrounded by paganism everywhere. So let me just say this. If that's you, it's not hopeless. It's not like, well, if I don't get them into Christian school, I mean Christians. Like, that. Don't think that way. That's fear mongering. If you have the option, could you? Sure, that's a great idea. But if you don't have the option, it's not hopeless. I think the reality is, it just means that you as the parent really have to step up more than ever and own parenting and be a larger influence and a greater voice to your kids than what they might be hearing in schools, at some of these schools they're in. Your kids their faith can survive public school, but not if you're not leading them well the rest of the time. And that, I mean, if there's going to be a guilt trip, I guess it's there. Like, they're your kids. Right? So if they're going to public schools, you got to be diligent. You got to talk to them. What are you learning? Tell me what's going on. In their free time, how are you prioritizing other ways they can get involved? One thing I find interesting, parents say, oh, the schools are so bad. I wish I could afford private school, but I can't. And it's like, oh, well, are they coming to youth group? Oh no, they got soccer they can never go to youth group. Well, then where are they being in any way connected to Christian community? And they'll I'll have parents say, oh, the world, the stuff that's on the internet, it's just so terrible. It's like, oh, so are you guarding your kids' phone? Oh no, they have their own phone. They watch whatever they want. Look, put your kids in the cleanest cut private Christian school in the world. It's not going to matter if they have their own phone and no regulations and they're watching whatever they want, whenever they want. If you have given your child a smartphone with no barriers, no limits, or no accountability, you're being unwise. You're being unwise. I'm not telling you you're sinning, but you're being unwise. Your child, especially under 14, 15 years old, is not prepared to handle the crap that's on there. And you should know there's a lot of crap on there. So, I mean, more than worrying about what school they're in, man, take the phone away. Put some accountability on it. Get them to church. Get them, if they're in middle school, bring them to the middle school service. If they're in high school, get them to youth group or something. Like, maybe you can't take them out of the public school, but you can still put them in other good environments for them to thrive. And you can guard the things that are really going to be problematic. You can pay attention to what Netflix things they're downloading, because there is some garbage on there. And they will be conformed to the pattern of the world if you don't stop that from happening. The phone, the Netflix, all that kind of stuff will conform their minds to the pattern of the world, because Netflix and YouTube, I know some of you are watching this on YouTube, I'm trying to offset it, will conform our minds to the pattern of the world. And your kids need you, the parent, to help steer them away from it, to be conformed to the image of Jesus rather than the crap that's being spewed at them on the internet, Instagram, and all this TikTok nonsense. Be the parent, take it away, put guardrails on it. And even if you're homeschooling, your kid can still go sideways, having that phone in their bedroom late at night, looking at all this crap. Okay, you got to do something about it. You got to step up. I'm standing by that, because my kids do not have smartphones. They don't have internet access without my permission. Like, I believe in that, and my wife does as well. All right, that got preachy. Whatever. Hey, we're talking about wisdom, and that's wisdom. Let's do another one. This one is way more theological. So here we go. What is the significance of Jesus being a high priest in the order of Melchizedek? Is that in contrast to the Levitical priesthood? What's the difference? Some of you hear me ask that question, and you're like, Levitical who? Melchizedek what? So let me give you a little, thanks, Brad. So my friend Brad is referencing the book of Hebrews that talks about Jesus being a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And he basically is like, what is he talking about? What does this mean? Is that a different priest than a normal priest? So let me spend a few minutes unpacking this a little bit. So very different direction. Last question was all like, personal stuff. This is all theological, biblical stuff. First, Melchizedek is first introduced in the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis. Off the top of my head, I think it's 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there. He was the king of Salem, which would later, we believe, became the city of Jerusalem. And it says that Abraham gave him a tithe and that Melchizedek was both a priest and a king of Salem. Actually, we don't even know which god he was a priest of, but that's a whole separate thing. And then in the book of Psalms, quite a bit later, there is what we call a messianic prophecy. And what I mean by that is it's a psalm, it's a song about King David, but it also was sort of looking ahead to the coming Messiah and prophesying. And in Psalm 110, it said this future king in the line of David would be in the order of Melchizedek. It would be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And that's what Hebrews is picking up on. So let's try to unpack this a little bit. First of all, the truth is we don't know a lot about who Melchizedek is. There's this brief reference in Genesis. There's a very, very short reference in Psalm. And then the author of Hebrews just goes on this thing. And when you read Hebrews, it's interesting to read it because you get there to chapter, I think, 6, 7, right in there in some of Hebrews. And it almost sounds like whoever the author of Hebrews was writing to, he just assumed that they knew what he was talking about. Because he makes this argument, and it happens sometimes in the Bible, because the person that whoever wrote whatever books did assume their readers knew certain things. So when you read Hebrews, it can be hard because you're like, it sounds like he's just assuming I know who Melchizedek is and what all this stuff is talking about. And I don't know what he's talking about. It's okay. To be in truth, we don't. So there's some things that are lost to us. There's some things that were behind the scenes that the author of Hebrews was talking about. Maybe there was another book, another reference to it that we're not familiar with. At least I'm not familiar with. Maybe someone out there is a better scholar than I am and could point me to it. So we don't know a ton about that. Here's what we do know, and this is where I think you could at least take this passage and say, okay, this is what I'm going to pull from it. So in the ancient Israelite world, you had 3 roles, and they were very distinct roles. The first role was the role of the king, and this is starting with Saul and moving forward. Before this, there was no king. There were only 2 roles. So there were 3 roles. There was a king, and the king's job was to lead the people. The king was what we today would call the political leader. The second role, and there was more than one of these people, were prophets. And we've talked about prophets before on this podcast. And prophets' job was to speak to the king what God was saying. So it was like the king is supposed to make the decisions, but he's supposed to consult the prophet to know that it's in line with God. The third role were the priests. And the priests were responsible primarily for worship. The priests were responsible for doing the sacrifices, maintaining the temple. They were the mediators, the go-between between God and humans. So when humans wanted to worship God, they worshiped through the priest. They'd bring the offering to the priest would sacrifice it, sprinkle the blood, all that kind of stuff you see in the Old Testament. Maybe that's a whole other podcast, I don't know. So the priest was the go-between, and the high priest was the ultimate go-between, who once a year would, on the Day of Atonement, would take all the sin of the people and put it on a goat and set it in the wilderness. So the priest mediated the presence of God to the people, and the king separately led the people, but was supposed to lead the people in line with. So these 3 groups all kind of work together. I mean, completely different, but in America, we have 3 systems of government. There's this check and balance. We have a president, we have judicial system holding them accountable, and then we have the Congress making the laws, the legislative branch. But what I want you to know about this is, so they serve very different functions, and their functions were meant to be separate. So both of them, both kings and priests represented gods in a way, but separately. The king was not supposed to offer sacrifices, and the priests weren't supposed to be in charge. At different times in Israel's history, you had tension with this, where kings tried to be priests and people pushed back. And you actually came to a point, the century or so before Jesus, where a lot of the priests were in charge and leading. Some of them even wanted to be kings. Like, no, you're a priest, you're not a king. So there were two separate, distinct things. Melchizedek, we don't know a lot about him, but what we do know, what is there, is that in some way, shape, or form, he was both a king and a priest. And this happens sometimes in other pagan religions, where a king could also be the high priest. It wasn't supposed to happen in Israel. But what the Messianic Psalm is saying is the Messiah, the one who'd come, would be that. He would be both the high priest and the king, and in the order of Melchizedek. And so the author of Hebrews is picking this up. Okay, that was... Why does any of that matter? Here's why it matters. The key is both a king and a priest were a middleman, right? Both a king and a priest were a middleman. If you were to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, there is no king, there is no priest, there's no prophet either. Because in the Garden of Eden, when God first created humans, God was king. People just asked God what they wanted, right? God, the tree of life in God's presence said, okay, don't eat from that, eat from that. This is good for you, go this way. There was no need for a king. And so when God first formed Israel, he told them, I don't want you to have a king. I want to be your king. Just do what I say, trust me. They didn't need prophets because they could talk to God themselves. And they certainly didn't need a priest. They didn't need anyone to mediate anything. God was walking with them in the garden. They had direct, immediate access to God anytime they wanted. What we see is sin, rebellion, the fall, shattered and fractured the relationship between humans and God. So now there's this separation because of our sin and our rebellion. And suddenly you introduce the priest, who has to be this go-between to offer sacrifices for us in order to make us right with God and all these kind of things. You now have a human king who has to lead us and tell us what to do, hopefully in line with what God wants. Well, now you have a prophet who, one of the few people, can actually hear God's voice and tell the king what to do and hope he listens, right? All of these things are the result of human brokenness. They were never part of God's creation. What we know about Jesus is the reason Jesus came was to restore and rebuild what had been broken. And so Jesus, being a king and a priest in the order of Melchizedek, in some ways is, and I'll try to bring this home, Jesus was bringing things back the way they were supposed to be because he was king. He was the one that leads and guides us, but he's also priest, the mediator. Okay, so who cares? Who cares? Well, here's why. Jesus is God himself. God has become a human, taken on flesh, and now is the direct access, the king, the priest right in front of us. So with Jesus, I don't need a middleman. I don't need anyone standing between me and God. I don't need anybody telling me, I don't need a broken human being telling me what to do. I don't need a prophet going to God and saying, God, tell us what you want. God can speak to me because God's spirit is now living in me. I am the image of God. I don't need a king. I don't need a prophet, and I don't need a priest. Why? Because of Jesus. He's all of it. He'll speak to me directly. He'll lead me directly. He is forget intermediary, he is Emmanuel, God with us. So when I approach Jesus, I am approaching Jesus. I'm skipping over the priest. When I listen to Jesus, I'm skipping over the prophet. When I'm led by Jesus, I'm skipping over the king. He's all of it himself. He is God in flesh, our king, our priest, our prophet, all of them. And you and I have direct access. There's no middleman. There's no go-between. You don't need it. And any attempt by humans to create a middleman, some of you want to make someone like me a pastor or a priest. No, don't do it. I need to find someone who can help me find God. Look, I'll talk to you about God. I'll talk to you about his wisdom and things and what the scriptures say, but you have direct access to God in and through Jesus, the King, the Christ. You don't need a priest. You don't need a king. You don't need a prophet. You have the Holy Spirit if you're a follower of Jesus, and you have direct access to him and his teachings and his word and forgiveness and all the things that priests could offer. So Jesus is so different than the prophets. He's so different than the priests. He's so different than the kings because they were all just normal human beings trying to work us through the problem of sin and the distance of God. But now God has come near and bridged that gap, and we no longer need anyone between us. which is good news, right? That's why they called it gospel, good news. All right, well, those were some good questions. I still have a few more, so maybe next week we'll see. We'll keep diving in. If you have any other questions, I think I have 3 more on my list, so I'd love to get some more. Shoot me an email at pete@risecitychurch.com. Maybe you can just even comment if you're watching on this on YouTube or on social media. Put a question right in the comments. And if you're listening on the audio podcast, thank you so much. Make sure you're subscribing. It really, really helps me if you subscribe. So I'd love it when you push that subscribe button because it helps the thing get out more and more people see it. Any kind of comments, even just little like buttons and things. I'd love it if you'd leave a review on Apple or Spotify. It's just helpful. More people see it. The aggregator things push it out more. So any way that you can share it, like it, all those kind of things, super helpful. And so we'll get back to it. Hopefully I won't wait another 3 weeks for the next podcast, but looking forward to answering some more of your questions and eventually getting into some other really big topics coming up. And yes, I will eventually make sure that interview happens with my friend about women in ministry. So have a great weekday. I don't know, depends when you're listening to this, but we'll see you next time on the Like Stars podcast. Thanks, everyone. You consume me and I burn alive when you're near me.